Thanks for staying with us. During the week, we celebrated Planet Earth with the theme, Restore Our Earth. The World Earth Day this year focused on natural processes, emerging green technologies, and innovative thinking that can restore the world's ecosystems. This morning, to talk a little more on that, we have Chukwumerije Okereke, who is Professor of Environment and Development from the University of Reading, as well as Desmond Majakodumi, who is an environmental activist. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and thoughts. Let me begin with you, Prof. This is like the 50-something edition of Earth Day. What's different this year?
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. Well, the difference this year, if any, is that it highlights the urgency, the need for much greater attention by all stakeholders to limit the damage that we all as a collective are doing to the planet system. Never before has the Earth been faced with such a grave danger. We are depleting our natural resources at an alarming rate. And some people have described Nigeria and Africa as the ground zero of global environmental challenges. And so the significance of the Earth Day this year is that there is a need for a much greater and concerted attention by all stakeholders to shine light on the damage, on the deterioration, on the exacerbation of the global Earth challenges that we are having, so that we can leave a planet that is inhabitable by future generations. And the worst area now is climate change, but actually there is no area where there is where the figures are not alarming. Whether you're talking about biological diversity, deforestation, the blue economy, consumption, you name it. The statistics tell a very alarming or paint an alarming picture in all spheres of the Earth system. So we need a new governance regime. We need a new international cooperation. We need the people like Des Magic, the civil society, to shout more and be more aggressive in drawing attention to this problem. Thank you.
Well, incidentally, Des Magic himself is here in this conversation with us. So let me just throw it, right at him. Well, Mr. Majakodumi, you have been at this for long enough, and consequently, the issues are right there at your fingertips. Perhaps we should begin from there. Of course, Professor Okereke has mentioned a few, but for you, what are those critical issues as far as the Earth is concerned that we may or may not be giving significant or any attention at all?
It's a good question, but Prof has really hit it on the head. The most critical issue is that the reality of the situation is that planet Earth supplies our life support, everything that we rely on to survive. The oxygen, the water, the food, the medication, everything. It comes from a stable Earth, which has been in harmony with itself for centuries upon centuries upon centuries, which is the only way that the human civilization was able to emerge, because of the relative stability and harmony that the Earth was operating on. And we have just been blasting away and blasting away and blasting away. And I think what needs to be very thoroughly and closely examined and dealt with is the reason why we have been blasting away. The reality is, and it's a painful reality, is that we human beings, or at least a very, very large group of us, have not been living in the requisite way that is required, the way that is required for the flagship species. We are the most intelligent species on the planet. We have wonderful capabilities. But unfortunately, we have not allowed ourselves to evolve enough to be responsible enough to use the fruits of our development, the fruits of witty invention, the fruits of our technology. We're still operating extremely primitively towards each other, fighting here, fighting there, using the technology so much to commit all kinds of atrocities against us. But worse still, we're committing those atrocities against nature. And in so doing, we are actually coming into conflict or contradiction or enacting some basic laws of action and reaction. Newton's third law of motion, every action begets a reaction. And nature is now reacting. Nature is now reacting, and she will react very, very violently. This is why Secretary General of the United Nations said very recently that mankind is committing war against nature, and this is suicidal, because nature always fights back, and she's fighting back with far more vehemence now. So what we're missing actually is the mindset. This is a wake-up call to all of us, that we need to have a renewal of our minds. We need to start behaving far more compassionately, far more caringly, not just towards each other, but towards this wonderful miracle of creation, which is our life support system. And then we can analyze those little and major specific things. Deforestation is one of the major issues that has to be tackled. And of course, this awful plastic pollution. And that's apart from the obvious, hundreds and hundreds of millions and millions of tons of different types of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That has to be stopped immediately. So this is it, renewal of the mind.
It's interesting, that you mentioned the fact that, the government angle, that governments don't seem to be giving enough attention. Because, on the one hand, this is a global program. This is a global celebration, so to speak. Earth Day is been done globally since 1970, and if memory serves right, we understand that it was one of the reasons that President Nixon of the U.S., created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency at the time, which came up with a number of other legislations in that country. But the question that bothers my mind right now, Mr. Maja Kudume, is if government started this, and even right there within the Sustainable Development Goals are a few items that talk about what we need to do concerning the environment, climate change, clean water, and all those things. How come governments all over the world, even here in Nigeria, aren't giving the kind of attention to Earth Day or to the Earth, as opposed to how it's
exactly. Yes, exactly. Again, it's a manifestation of this issue that we're highlighting. There has to be a change in our attitudes. And, in all fairness, there are some people who are making those changes. People like Prof. there, he's coming to this realization many, many years ago. And just recently, there was this wonderful climate summit just a couple of days ago, which was driven by the United States President himself, and several other government leaders came. And they have started to make the right sort of pledges. And also there are people in the United Nations, the Secretary General and other people in the World Health Organization, World Meteorological Organization, who, they've seen the data, they've seen the science, and the reality is, to put it in an extremely simplistic way, 2 + 2 = 4. It does. Yeah, it does. And the law of gravity is a real law, and that's one of the expressions of the law of action and reaction. And they're seeing the science, they've seen the data, and they're getting scared. So, the hope is that people of the world, and we're seeing a lot of the young people now, are deciding to say, hey, no, this is our future at stake. You elders have caused all this problem because of your very, very wrong attitudes, not just towards each other, but expressing them also towards nature, our very life support systems, which are in the process of wrecking. Look, we only have between 8 to 12 years, probably about 10 years, to address this. And once we go beyond that, we now start to get into a scenario where it becomes, the degradation becomes irreversible. You know, as great as our technology might be, or as great as we think our technology might be, there's been situations many times. We've seen hurricanes, massive hurricanes coming to New York. They know exactly when it's going to come, where it's going to come. And with all the moon landing, Mars landing technology, they cannot divert that hurricane for 1 inch or delay for 1 second. So don't rely on the technology. Just rely on our attitude, which must change, and the people of the world have to come together. And this is the silver lining of the cloud, because for once, all of humanity is faced with this major problem. It's an existential problem, and the only way the problem is going to be solved is by humanity coming together, and the technology to bring us together is already here. Prof is over there in Europe, I'm here in Lekki, you're over there where you are. We're all coming together. We need to come together to solve this. And guess what? Guess what? Forget about your religion. Forget about your ethnicity, your tribe. Forget about your gender. We are all one people on one planet, and we must come together and inform our governments that they must follow the instructions of their leaders. We're in democracy. We are leaders of the government. They are serving us now, is it not? So we got to put far more pressure on them. All
right. Well, Dr. Okereke, let me bring this back to you. I'm looking at almanac.com, for instance, their own page on this Earth Day. They listed 10 things, 10 activities that people can do where they are. Government has its job cut out for it, no doubt. But it's interesting, one of the things that's recommended, Professor Okereke, by these people about taking care of Earth is to think about our diet. And I find that quite interesting. I find it interesting because, I mean, it's so simple. Is that to say that what we need to do individually to pay attention to Earth is that simple, or is as complex as what governments must do all over the world?
Well, thanks very much. First of all, let me just step back a little bit and add to the excellent answer that Majek gave you with respect to why it appears that we have been celebrating Earth Day for a very, very long time, and yet it appears also that very little has been achieved. The central challenge lies in the tension between economic development and Earth management. The fact is that actually, in order to live a decent life, you need a certain level of economic development. However, it gets to a point where if you are not careful in the way you exploit natural resources in order to support development, you end up undermining the very basis upon which development depends. So let me give you a critical example. So you see, for example, we have depended for many, many years on fossil fuel in order to have light in our home, in order to be able to drive our car. But climate change is also caused by the pumping of pollutions coming from that heating of our home or driving of our car or powering our economic system. And precisely because we, in what we call externalities, we haven't made the people that are profiting the most from these economic activities to pay. So for example, you're producing your soap, you pour the water into the ocean or the river next to you. You sell your soap at 20 naira because you are able to pour the soapy water filled with detergent into the neighboring river, which is then collected by your neighbor 10 kilometers down the line. Whereas if actually companies are made to internalize that externality. The cost of soap may be more, but then the environment will be preserved. And as Majek said, we need to understand that it is in the interest, our own interest, to behave in a more environmental sustainable way. And the example you gave in diet is a very good example. In Europe, where I am currently residing, one of the biggest challenges is obesity. Obesity comes from eating more than you actually need to survive. It turns out that in doing so, especially when you are eating plenty of meat, you are also adding to climate change, because a lot of what we call greenhouse gas emission comes from rearing of cows. And so the almanac is right that in looking at how we eat, changing our diet, for example, eating less meat, we will be able to contribute significantly to lowering greenhouse gas emissions. And this is vital because, as Majek already said, if we can find a balance, the example of diet that you gave is a perfect one. If we can, drive less, live less ostentatious life, eat only what we need, trek a little bit more, exercise, we will be preserving nature while also living healthier. So it is not always the case that by looking after the environment, you have to go and live like a dinosaur or go and live in the Stone Age. In fact, more and more evidence are emerging that life lived in the balance between nature and economic development can be the best. Look at China, for example. We celebrate China because China has grown its economy sometimes up to 2-digit in the last 20 years. But the consequence is that if you go to Beijing, sometimes you're not able to see more than 50 meters because of air pollution. And now China is spending nearly 7% of its GDP trying to address air pollution. And more people die as a result of air pollution in China than any other disease. So this, again, is a clear example of how often you can go too much on the other side, trying to pursue economic development at the expense of caring for the planet Earth. So yes, individual change of diet is necessary, but there are also many things which the government needs to do in order to lay down the structure to enable people to live in a more sustainable way.
Challenge that you have raised now, Prof, is that there is quite a lot to do, and I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, but let's begin with what the people need to do. Come to government. You've talked about, governments, beg your pardon, private organizations that use, that one way or the other pollute the environment. But let's talk about what people themselves can do to reduce risks to the environment. If you can give us a few, so that those who are watching us right now all over the world can do their own bit.
Oh, thank you. There are many things. We've already talked about eating responsibly, changing your diet to eat less meat. But the general reduction in consumption is a big issue. There are many people, especially in developed world, that, own far too much stuff. They have more cars than they need. They have more clothing than they need. They have more food than they need. Do you know that nearly 50% of the food that is bought from the supermarket here in the UK are eventually wasted? Not to talk of the wastage that happens in the supermarkets themselves. There are many people that have 3 wardrobes and they don't wear all these clothes. Why do you need 3 big cars when you can only ride in one? Why do you need to keep your house heated more than necessary? So people need to generally lower their consumption. Then you have to travel in an environmentally sustainable way. Better to use bicycle. I just went to the city center and came back this morning. I rode on the bicycle, okay? I could have driven my car, but I didn't need to. And also, by riding the bicycle, I'm trying to keep healthy. This is another great example on how you can live a more sustainable life, but also live a healthier life. And so you ride bicycle, you walk where you can. I see people who are driving all over the place when they can actually walk. Majek has talked about the right disposal of waste. Don't throw your sachet paper all around. Put it in the right place. There is also what we call segregation of waste, you know, and on I can go. Plant trees. Don't deforest. Don't cook with, you know, dirty cooking stove materials. There are just so many things that individually we can do. The whole concept of individual environmental responsibility is a big issue, and I'm happy that you are highlighting it. We may talk about the companies and government, but yes, you're right. There are several things we can do at our individual level.
All right, well, Mr. Majo Kodumi, let me bring this to you. Prof mentioned something earlier about technology and development and how that has had its own effect on the way we do things. So if you were to speak to that balance, how would it go? On the one hand, we need development. Technology plays a huge role in that. At the same time, we need to consider the environment. How do we get a balance? Because that's clearly a responsibility for both governments and the private sector.
Absolutely, and the desire to develop is a little bit flawed, you know, to be honest. It's a little bit, because what sometimes looks like development in terms of, okay, you're going to set up a nice urban center in the middle of the wetland, which you sandfield and sandfield. In the long term, if in that process of your development, or as Prof alluded to, you're using energy systems that are deadly and polluting, like we did in Beijing and so on. So in the long term, if you're wrecking the very life support system that you rely on, it's not development. It might just have the illusion. So, you know, we come to a critical stage now. This is a critical turning point for humanity. Either we get it right and we start to move on to a far better world, a far more harmonious world, which is run by far better principles. I know this sounds very idealistic. And, you know, 20, 30, 40 years ago, it would have been idealistic. But now, we're talking about simply surviving. Because if we don't change our attitude, particularly to the environment, to nature, the type of catastrophic consequences will be more than horrendous. Honestly, you can't even see it in your worst nightmares. A little glimpse of it is what some of those terrible, terrible internally displaced people's camps look like. We have hundreds of millions of people living by the coast. Nigeria is particularly vulnerable. The oceans are rising. The voracity of the weather patterns that are hitting our coast now are far worse. We're going to be opening up ourselves for far worse floods. Places like Lagos could be actually almost half submerged in the next 30, 40 years if this continues, not to mention other coastal cities. Where would those people be rushing to? Go and meet people that are running from the desert encroachment and go and meet them in a place that is subject to terrible valley erosion and so on? No, our attitude was changed. So yes, okay, you have your technology which you want to use for development. Primarily, you have to look at the environmental impact. Is this going to be good for the environment? If it's not, you adjust it until it is, and if you can't adjust it until it is, you reject it, no matter how profitable it is. And again, part of the problem, as Prof so rightly alluded to, is this worshipping of the profit margin.
Mr. Majakumi, just 1 second. Just 1 second, because we are already gradually winding now. But I just want to ask this: does that mean, because there is such a thing as environmental, impact assessment, does that mean that we compromise, on this, between government and the private sector?
Oh, yes, we've never followed. We've just allowed ourselves to be corrupted again by this greed, 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 greed. And the reality is that, here we are in Nigeria, we're a God-fearing country, and we better start listening to what God says in his scriptures. And what does he say? What's the most fundamental thing in the scriptures? Love him. Love the Creator. If you love the Creator, you have to love his creation. How can your father give you the most wonderful house, which gives you all the services? You say, Daddy, I love you. You set fire to the house. Nonsense, especially if your children are in the house. You pay a very, very high price for that. Retribution is a very, very serious law. So we need to adjust. The time has come. And I'm very optimistic because programs like this, here we are on this great channel. Lots of people will be listening. You have people like Prof coming in, people like yourself, enlightened minds their consciousness is being raised about the urgency of the situation and what's causing the problem. The problem is coming from the aberrant behavior of our character. Our characters need to change. We need to be far more caring, loving, love our God, love his creation, and love our neighbors. And hey, we'll make the world a better place.
I guess you have just given some people a reason for going to church tomorrow. When you go to church, thank you very much.
And you, no more for more and suya for you, right?
Well, as somebody said, when they saw Don said that you should shun pomo in order to avoid cancer, a cartoonist said, Don, go back to your lab. But for now, we have to leave this at this point. Chukwumeri Okereke, Professor of Environment and Development at University of Reading, thank you so much for your time and thoughts, as well as Desmond Majakodume, who is an environmental activist. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time this morning. Okay, so we are taking the home stretch when we return. Do stay with us.